Wow. Well, that got me moving, and the dancer in me could not stand still. Okay. Let me get my page to my talk. Here we go. So I'm Leigh Waters, and I'm an artist. And I began this talk with my first time in a big museum. So a little bit of me, that was perhaps my life, where my life began as an artist. And it was followed right after by a time going to concerts and live drawing shows at the Banff Center, as I lived in Banff for a gap year before going on to college. And in my 20s, I went to university and also pursued a fine arts degree in visual art and art history. I've kept an art practice throughout my life, despite or in spite of limitations. I've also studied art therapy, which was what brought me to Victoria 31 years ago. And today my talk is on early abstract art and spirituality. And this is where our slideshow begins. But first, let's go to some definitions of abstract art before I link it to spirituality, which was what the first abstract artist paintings were about. I also want to clarify that I am talking about Western art, history, and culture. Abstract art existed in many other cultures and times. Europeans, however, have been fixated on perspective and a naturalistic representation of reality from about the 15th century Renaissance until the early 19th century or so. So the ideas and images that I'm presenting today are not necessarily exclusive to Western culture or the last 150 years. These are the first images you see on the screen. They are Kandinsky's work beginning in 1912 and progressed more or less chronologically. The most common definition I found on the internet of abstract art is art that does not attempt to represent external reality, but seeks to achieve its effect using shapes, forms, colors, and textures. From the Tate Gallery website, the main feature of abstract art is that it is non-representational, a non-representational practice, meaning that art movements that embrace abstraction departure from accurate representation. Abstract art is art that does not attempt to represent an accurate depiction of visual reality, but instead uses shapes, colors, forms, and general marks to achieve its effect. Vasily Kandinsky. So Vasily Kandinsky is the first artist that comes to mind with the topic of abstract art and spirituality. He has been claimed to be the first abstract artist. He certainly was the first artist that had widespread exposure of spiritual paintings, which are abstracts. Born in 1866, Kandinsky was both a painter and an art theorist. He initially studied law and economics and got a degree in Moscow, after which he took up a professorship outside of Moscow. Kandinsky began painting studies, life drawing, sketching, and anatomy at the age of 30 and moved back to Moscow. In 1896, after some travels, he began studying art in Munich. In 1911, this is the big part here, his text concerning the spiritual in art was published. In 1912, while still in Germany, his paintings very suddenly became abstract, devoid of landscape, human form, or references to one religion or spiritual belief. They were free from images of European religious symbols of the previous centuries. He developed his own theology and ritual, and he chose his own religious path. Kandinsky wrote in his journal, "But everything which adequately expresses the inner need is beautiful. That is beautiful, which is produced by the inner need, which springs from the soul." Well, is Kandinsky's work beautiful? Is the harmony he paints in accord with the harmony that follows, respecting other person's beliefs, personal beliefs? He returned to Moscow in 1914 after the outbreak of World War II. In Russia, for a time, he was accepted as an artist, but eventually his spiritual outlook was foreign to the augmentative materialism of society in the Soviet, and he returned to Germany in 1920, where he taught at the famous Bauhaus School of Art until the Nazis closed it in 1933. after he moved to France, where he took up citizenship and lived out his remaining years. Now let's go back to my trip to Moscow in the Tetrakoff Gallery. My high school group had toured St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow the day before the tour of the Tetrakoff Museum, and I was fascinated by the juxtaposition of the cathedral's Byzantine paintings, the repeating organic lines covering the interior, and its external 18th century renovations. To me, Kandinsky's abstract paintings seemed a natural progression from the exterior shapes and colors of this cathedral, as well as interior designs you would have seen of this famous Moscow landmark. And his paintings after 1911 seemed like abstractions of his own landscapes. And in the few years before writing his text on the spiritual and art. Kandinsky worked in a time after the Cultural Revolution and before capitalism. He created within the framework art can transcend religion and borders, and he wrote in his diary that maybe even borders will disappear. With the border-defined internet, perhaps Kandinsky's anticipation of borderless countries is partly true. He wrote, "The various arts of today learn from each other and often resemble each other. The greatest freedom of all, the freedom of an unfettered art, can never be absolute. Every age achieves a certain measure of this freedom, but beyond the boundaries of its freedom, the mightiest genius can never go. But the measures of freedom of each age must be constantly enlarged." And Kandinsky certainly enlarged freedom for artists and people who chose their own path of spiritual belief. So I'm finishing this portion of the slideshow in which Kandinsky, with the house that both Kandinsky and the architect Miles Vanderholt were both lived in Paris until their final years. It also was which is just another slide coming up, I think. I'm a little bit ahead of myself. There we go. It will turn soon. So this is the house that they lived in, and a very contemporary Bauhaus as well. Bauhaus influenced architecture. So next, let's look at another artist who freed her thinking and spiritual beliefs, and then her art. She worked in abstract form, and more than a decade earlier than Kandinsky. However, she did not exhibit this work. So here we have Hilma af Klint, and the slide just before was of Kandinsky. Klimt was a Swedish landscape painter. She began experimenting with automatic drawing as early as the 1880s. She completed her first abstract paintings in 1906 in a series at the age of 44. This work is called Primordial, simply Primordial. These first works were done very quickly and directly with no corrections or pre-drawings. She was little known in her life, and her work possibly was exhibited in London only once. A collection of 1,800 paintings, drawings, and journal pages was rediscovered in the 1970s and shown in the 1980s. I came across her about 5 years ago. She approached the art critic Rudolf Steiner in 1908, but got a sour reception from him, saying her work would not be accepted for 50 years. And that the 111 paintings she had done thus far were not suitable for representing theosophy, a religion that also Kandinsky was interested in. And I can only imagine her feelings of dejection from Steiner's visit. She later willed her work to her nephew with the condition it not be shown for 20 years after her death. The public was not ready for them, she said. But Steiner in 1912 hailed Kandinsky, naming him the first abstract artist, and possibly having shown Kandinsky some colored photos of abstract paintings that he had taken from his visit with Klimt. Like for Kandinsky, theosophy was a part of the inspiration for Klimt's abstract works. Theosophy, a new religious movement, started in America and was brought to Europe likely around before 1900. Now, I'm not particularly knowledgeable about theosophy, which to me sounds like a complex system of beliefs invented mainly by Madame Blavatsky in America. But it also brought philosophies from India and China to America and Europe. And my best understanding of one of the Oriental philosophies comes from Taoism, which is about dualism. And this is very predominant in some of Klimt's works that are just coming up in the slides. Taoism is about dualism, about the yin and yang. But Taoism illuminates the need for an intermediary with God, and God, or gods even. However, Taoism was actually practiced in China along with Confucianism and Buddhism too. They studied Taoist Tai Chi for 10 years, and at that time chanted and learned meditation from the Fengli Taoist temple. On the altar were paintings of Immortal Yu, the Jade Emperor, and the Bodhisattva Guan Yin, which acknowledges the three great religions of China: Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. This particular slide on the screen is part of Klimt's Swan series, which become very, very abstract. And again, we're dealing with dualism. The relationship with Eastern and Western religious philosophies was fermented into belief in the masters by Madame Blavatsky, which I will not expound on today because the impact of Klimt's and Kandinsky's work remains with us today, and theosophy is not often referred to. Studying spiritualism and the occult and holding seances could go hand in hand with an artist's interest in scientific discoveries about energy and the atom. Klimt belonged to a group of 5 women who studied spiritualism and the occult at meetings. Before seances, they had a reading from the Bible. These were food for her creativity. Her paintings contained letters and colors and symbols, and she wrote many journals on her spiritual experiences and her fascination with botany and the sciences. This particular slide is from her Heart series. Helma F. Klimt felt she was being directed by a force that would literally guide her hand. She wrote in her notebook, "The pictures were painted directly through me, without any preliminary drawings, and with great force. I had no idea what the paintings were supposed to depict. Nevertheless, I worked swiftly and surely, without changing a single brush stroke." And this was written about her first series of paintings, which you saw at the very beginning of the slideshow. She began her automatic drawings or scribblings and gesture drawings in the time of the discoveries about radio waves, X-rays, quantum theory, radioactivity, and the theory of relativity, a period from the late 1880s to the mid-1910s. These advancements in science were often referred to when I was studying early 20th century and how important they were to the artists practicing of the time. But the biggest difference, say, between Kandinsky and Klimt is that perhaps he was expressing only an internal reality, and she ought to express an external reality as well as the internal. It took almost a decade for other artists to paint abstractly and about their spiritual beliefs, spirituality, or how to express an external reality which we cannot see. What drove Klimt? The idea of transcending the physical world and the constraints of representational art. I highly recommend the documentary Beyond the Physical. It's free on Canopy, which is through your library online, or openculture.com to find out more about this woman and her fascinating life, her artwork, and the story of women in art history. As a young woman in my 20s studying at university, first Renaissance art history, and then encountering 20th century art, my knowledge of the spiritual art was mainly from stained glass windows in churches, with biblical stories, engravings in the Bible of fearful scenes, and murals and paintings in churches. It was revolutionary for me to encounter abstract art, and it quickly became my home for the spiritual and art with other artists such as Max Ernst. So another German, he used orbs in his paintings to represent the sublime in nature. This is the last picture of our slideshow, and it shows the size of those first drawings, paintings of Klimt, which were done on paper on the ground. Similarly, when I first encountered Unitarianism, it became my home, where I often hear belief is personal, and people develop their own theology or philosophy in life. There is a forum after our service, both on Zoom and in person. With this view we've just had of how a couple of artists express their spiritual beliefs, I'd like to hear what visual you have or do, or you know, that has meaning and expresses your spiritual beliefs, spirituality, and philosophy. Thank you for your time today for me to share a topic of interest in me. And our next song will be Galaxies, if I'm correct.